Music, said Mendelssohn, is a language too precise for words. I've often thought of that when making programs like this. There is a real limit to what words can do when it comes to explaining music for a listener. But what about when music is combined with words? Well, then it gets more complex. And if you then add plot, stage action, scenery, well, still though, there are things that music can tell us that the other elements combined can't, or at least maybe not quite so precisely as Mendelssohn would put it. And I've realised that some of my favourite moments in opera, once you've got past the good tunes or vivid illustrative passages business, are the turning points, the moments when a character or characters realise something vitally significant. We, at least, know that things can't ever be the same again. And today, I'd like to home in on 3 of those and see just how music adds a level of meaning words can't. I want to start with a great turning point from comic opera, Mozart's Marriage of Figaro. Central to this bustling, super-exuberant comedy is the figure of Count Almaviva. Now, he's a rather interesting figure. Today, no one's very surprised when a nobleman is portrayed as a sexual predator taking advantage of feudal power structure to get his own way. But in Mozart's time, in the late 18th century, this was incendiary. Now, Mozart and his librettist Lorenzo da Ponte probably had in mind a much gentler form of justice. The Count is thwarted, and indeed outwitted, by his 2 servants, Susanna and Figaro. Early on in Act 1, Figaro sings an aria whose words must have had some Viennese aristocrats squirming awkwardly in their well-upholstered seats. If, my dear Count, you feel like dancing, I'll call the tune. The orchestra heightens this. We have a stiff, puppet-like little dance for pizzicato strings and very plain, simple harmonies, just about as undignified, as unnoble as you could imagine.
Se vuol ballare, signor continuo, se vuol ballare, signor continuo, il chitarrino.
Now, one interesting feature of the Marriage of Figaro hadn't struck me till I began to look at it for this programme. The Count is a central character, but he doesn't actually have an aria of his own until well into the 3rd act, and this is when he's begun to realise that he's being cornered. There's a lot of testosterone-fueled raging and blustering about vengeance and the lower orders getting out of hand in music like this. But in music like that, we don't see a lot of what it is that might make the Count redeemable. For this, we see him musically through the eyes of others, and particularly through those of his oft-betrayed wife, the Countess. In this famous aria from Act 3, she recalls the happy times of their first love, when she saw a very different side of her husband. The words of that aria tell of a wife betrayed, lamenting her loss. But to me, the music says something more. Surely the man who could inspire feelings like this must be worth something. Then come the fun and games of Act 4. Susanna and the Countess conspire to catch the Count out, to make him think he's meeting Susanna, when it's really his wife in disguise. This is one of the few moments in opera where the classic disguise device hints at something really quite profound. The woman the Count's chasing is actually the woman he's married to. Is he looking for what he's actually lost? Then comes the moment of revelation. The Count stands exposed before the whole cast, revealed as a callous philanderer, brought low by the superior intelligence of his menials. This could send him into transports of rage exceeding even that Act 3 aria. Instead, there comes a moment of extraordinary tenderness. Contessa perdona, Countess forgive me, forgive me, forgive me, 3 times. Sometimes, even knowing this opera well, I've read the synopsis and said to myself, oh yes, he may be caught out for the moment, just wait though, he'll go back to his old ways very soon. But Mozart's music suggests that something much deeper has happened, that this man has truly been humbled, and that his better nature, hinted at in the Countess's aria, is revealed, and in just 2 musical phrases. But that's the point. They're his only lyrical moment in the entire opera, but how it tells. And after the Count, the Countess's magnanimity in accepting his apology seals everything. It reflects back the Count's lyrical confession. Everyone has shown themselves superior to the so-called nobleman, and he accepts it. Graciously, the music tells us. Rationally, one may still have one's doubts, but in the face of that music, perhaps it's another matter. Now for another of these crucial operatic turning points, again involving a nobleman, but if it's comedy, it's of the blackest kind, and the Duke of Mantua in Verdi's Rigoletto has no redeeming features at all beyond a certain animal charm. He really is a cruel, callous seducer. The Duke has no turning point. He's unchangeable, possibly because he's completely, almost innocently heartless. At the other extreme, however, is the deformed jester Rigoletto, Figaro, you might say, turned sour. You get a sense of what the opera is about, and how utterly removed it is from the world of Figaro in the work's prelude, right at the start. It begins with a jagged motive on one note, which is normally known as the curse motive, but I don't think you have to know that to get the general gist. Rigoletto has one possible redeeming feature, and that's his intense love for his daughter Gilda. But it is very intense. He keeps her a virtual prisoner. Eventually, of course, she falls for the Duke's wiles. Rigoletto's crazily overprotective behaviour has hardly prepared her for his sort. That ominous motif that we heard at the beginning is turned into a literal curse by the enemy of the Duke, Count Monterone. He curses both the Duke and Rigoletto. But before that, Verdi is able to suggest that in some mysterious way, Rigoletto is already accursed. It happens as Rigoletto mocks another of the Duke's victims, Count Ceprano. He's been cuckolded by the Duke. The acid mockery is pronounced to the same repeated note and almost the same rhythm as the curse motive, which forms a brilliant contrast with the trivial dance band music in the background.
In testa che avete, signor di Ceprano, è sbuffa, vedete, che testa si riluta, mi consiglio, così non è sempre.
And after Monterone's curse, Rigoletto broods alone. Quel vecchio maledivemi. That old man put a curse on me. Now to exactly the same one-note line and fateful rhythm as the curse motive in the prelude. Musically, Verdi is telling us that Rigoletto has almost begun to embody the curse. In some mysterious way, it is him. I won't go too far into the complicated machinations of the plot. Basically, Rigoletto arranges to have the Duke murdered by the hitman Sparafucili and then have the body conveyed to him in a sack. But by one of those typical operatic reversals Rigoletto doesn't know about yet, it's his daughter Gilda, who's disguised herself as the Duke, who's been fatally stabbed and brought to him for his savage delectation. We share, eventually, in Rigoletto's dawning horror, even though we already know what's happened through musical devices. It may seem like a very simple kind of trick today, but the effect must have been devastating in Verdi's time. In the midst of a dark and stormy night, Rigoletto is gloating over his triumph. "Now," he says, addressing the Duke in his head, "we'll see who's the fool, Buffone, and who the powerful one." Then, in the midst of Rigoletto's apparent triumph, he hears the Duke singing what's more or less his theme tune, you'll know it instantly, in the distance, off stage. Now, this use of distance, actual spatial distance, is so telling. The Duke represents a kind of amoral life force. Apparently, he's indestructible. Monterone's curse doesn't really seem to touch him at all. The real curse is Rigoletto's own nature. Everything has rebounded on him. The possessiveness of his daughter, his plans to have the Duke assassinated on stage, and the foreground, his music inhabits literally a different space, a different world. The Duke's song goes on blithely as before. Rigoletto's vocal lines crumble. They disintegrate like him unravelling piteously before us. The idea that music can add levels of meaning, especially to these crucial turning points in opera, that it can comment on, enhance action, and even help us understand the unconscious depths of characters, all this was strongly championed by Wagner. Nothing in opera illustrates this better than the famous opening motive of Tristan und Isolde. Everything that needs to be said about painful desire and the still more painful knowledge of where it must all end seems to be expressed and summed up in the first breathtaking 3 bars of Tristan, and the continuation, the sequence of unresolved aching dissonances, it only enhances our understanding. Somehow, you know this story's not going to have a happy end. Then follows a longer breathed melody. It's sometimes described as the motive of longing, sometimes as looking. Imagine someone looking into someone else's eyes, searching for their soul. Wagner's motifs go on resonating, hinting at meanings, enhancing, sometimes subverting the actions or words on the stage. A good example of this is the fateful moment towards the end of Act 1. The captive Isolde has been taken, very unwillingly, by Tristan as bride for his master and friend King Marca. She's ordered her servant Brangeni to prepare a poisoned drink for herself and for Tristan to end all this horror. Tristan more than half suspects that that's what it is, but he accepts anyway. But Brangeni's done a swap. Instead of the poison, we have a love potion. The irony, of course, is that Tristan and Isolde don't need it. Their seeming enmity is, as in the classic Mills and Boone situation, concealing a powerful attraction. Having taken the potion, they both drop, seemingly dead for a moment, then awake, and the truth is out. We hear both those motives from the prelude, the yearning, unresolved figure separated by those aching pauses, and then the longer singing line, looking for recognition. And now Tristan and Isolde themselves sing along and are united, they're joined by the flow of that looking, longing melody. Yet at the same time, they retain their distinct melodic shapes as they sing each other's names. Isolde's Tristan and Tristan's Isolde. Listening to this music, one senses that surely the ideal union, the consummation devoutly to be wished, is at hand. And then comes a sudden reversal. Just when we think that Tristan and Isolde are about to, well, I'm sure you know what I mean, they're interrupted by the chorus announcing the arrival of the boat in Cornwall, King Marca's domain. There's rejoicing, but not for the lovers. And we sense that something isn't complete. It isn't just that they haven't ravished each other. The searching in those two motives for some sort of recognition, to still the longing, it's still there. And the high point of that longing or looking idea comes at possibly the most heartbreaking moment of all, in Act 3 of the opera. It's especially heartbreaking because there's a remote possibility for a moment that this opera might just have a happy ending. The sick Tristan, he turns out to be mortally wounded, is waiting for Isolde in his castle in Brittany overlooking the sea. Eventually a sail is sighted. There's a long, ecstatic build-up, and Isolde arrives. She rushes onto the stage. "Tristan," she shouts, to the motive by which she originally sang his name, the motive of looking, searching for recognition. But now it's contracted by a semitone. The searching's more anxious. There's a long wait for Tristan's response as the orchestral storm of passion dies down. Then the longing, looking motive begins to rise in the orchestra, slowly, effortfully. Tristan sings his response to its dying fall, Isolde, to exactly the same notes as he sang it the first time. In the background, the long, looking orchestral motive now tries to lift itself again, like Tristan. Instead, astonishing, isn't it, the way that phrase, which once flowed forward, now breaks off unfinished, and then Isolde's simple response, "Ha," and then the rest is silence. In the passage that follows, Isolde seems to refuse to believe it. "Tristan can't be dead. Why are you silent?" she asks him. "Open your eyes." But in that broken phrase, the gaping silence, and Isolde's "ha," we sense the realization that she must have already come to, and which she'll understand fully in her great Liebestod, the climax of the opera. What is this understanding? It's of the tragedy of longing, the illusory nature of hope in this life, what the opening of the prelude sang hours ago in those similarly broken, unresolved phrases. Desire, yearning, longing for perfect love, for fusion with another. It's impossible. Eventually, this leads to transcendence, as Isolde seeks fulfillment not in love, but in renunciation of the world and its illusions, in death. But before Isolde has expressed a word of it, before she's conscious of it, Wagner's music tells us that on the deepest, unconscious level, this knowledge has already dawned.
The closing note of Tristan and Isolde by Wagner. And Stephen Johnson will be back with Discovering Music on Tuesday next week, when he'll be looking at Stravinsky's Oedipus Rex.